Welcome, friend, wherever you're listening from bed, couch, or a quiet corner of your night. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're going back to where it all began. Before 1,000 ships sailed, it started with one golden apple. Not a battle, not a prophecy, just a petty argument at a wedding no one really wanted to attend. Stay with me, and you'll see how the smallest insult started the loudest war in all of Greek myth. You find yourself drifting back through time to an era before Homer began singing, before ships launched and swords clashed back, when the fate of Troy was still unbothered by destiny. Welcome to the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, a formal event, only made possible because Zeus wanted to avoid a prophecy. You are among the gods. Well, not one of them. You're more like a silent guest, watching from the mosaic-tiled edge of Olympus as the divine realm prepares for a social event with consequences far too mortal. A wedding of avoidance. It begins, as so many Greek myths do, with a prophecy. A nymph, Thetis, was said to bear a son greater than his father. Naturally, Zeus and Poseidon both declined the opportunity to woo her. Risk assessment was rarely the gods' strong suit, but in this case, they erred on the side of caution. And so Thetis was married off to a mortal, Peleus, a decorated warrior whose most significant accomplishment until then had been not offending Zeus. The wedding was an awkward affair from the start. Held on Mount Pelion, it included the full divine guest list -1. Eris, goddess of discord, was uninvited. An understandable decision, really. No one wants the personification of strife at their catered event. Eris arrives anyway. Of course, Eris did what any slighted deity would do. She arrived anyway, not in person, but in effect. In the middle of the feast, just as Apollo was tuning his lyre and Hera was pretending to enjoy nectar, Eris's gift clattered. Into the middle of the marble banquet floor, a single golden apple. Inscribed upon it, to the fairest. You imagine the moment. Quiet sipping stops. Conversations trail off. The apple glints in the firelight. 3 goddesses step forward. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each, claiming the title with a confidence that only immortals can manage. It was, quite literally, the birth of a beauty pageant, but one with no rules, no judging panel, and no talent segment. The goddesses turned to Zeus. The argument that followed was more grating than fierce. Voices raised with the sort of timeless bickering that only eternity can perfect. The goddesses turned to Zeus, father of gods, king of Olympus. He, in turn, did what any wise leader does when faced with impossible interpersonal conflict. He delegated Dot, and so the apple and its troubles were handed off to a young mortal Paris, son of Priam, prince of Troy, and reputed to have an eye for fairness. Or, more accurately, a shepherd with a great reputation among nymphs and a fairly open schedule. Paris had no idea what was coming. Paris, the most reluctant judge we find Paris, living a quiet pastoral life, far from the opulence of Troy's palace. Raised away from his royal family due to a suspicious prophecy about him bringing ruin to Troy. Prophecies were the ancient world's background noise. Paris was a calm man of simple habits. He tended sheep. He played the lyre. He once awarded a prize bull to Eris, disguised as a farmer, which speaks volumes about his skill at recognizing divinity. So it was Paris who received the golden apple. But with it came 3 goddesses, shimmering with power and practically vibrating with expectation. They did not present themselves plainly. No goddess would. They arrived with grandeur, each prepared to argue her case for being the fairest, each armed with a bribe. The bribes, quietly absurd. First came Hera, regal, queen of the gods, and often underestimated. She offered Paris dominion kingship over all of Asia. A compelling offer, especially for a man living off sheep's milk and rustic olives. Next came Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. She promised invincibility in battle, mastery of strategy, and the admiration of warriors. Not bad if Paris were inclined toward warfare, which, notably, he was not. Finally, Aphrodite stepped forward with her singular bribe, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen of Sparta. Paris, in a moment of decisiveness that would echo through centuries, handed her the apple. This was not a grand gesture. It was not a profound philosophical decision. It was simply the choice of a young man guided by desire, curiosity, and perhaps the quiet hope that this might be the beginning of something more exciting than shepherding. Helen, a quiet life in Sparta, but Helen was already married, not just to anyone, but to Menelaus, king of Sparta. And her marriage had been arranged with no small effort. It involved a binding oath among the Greek leaders that they would all defend her husband if she were ever wronged. A clever preventative measure from Odysseus, who was always more diplomat than soldier. Helen lived a quiet life in Sparta, filled with the rituals and expectations of a royal woman. She was known more for her poise than her passion, more for her silence than her statements. In fact, little is written about what Helen thought of all this, and that is perhaps the most historically compelling point. The war that would be sparked from this moment rooted in a judgment, a bribe, and a beauty centered around a woman whose voice remains largely unheard. Was she abducted? Did she go willingly? Did she simply drift? The gods stirred the pot meanwhile. The gods were hardly passive observers. Each had taken sides. Hera and Athena, snubbed, simmered with divine pettiness. Aphrodite, triumphant, guided. Paris toward his prize, with a smirk that one can only imagine spanned several continents. Paris was sent to Sparta under the guise of diplomacy. There, he met Helen. What passed between them remains one of history's blurriest conversations. Some say he wooed her. Others suggest enchantments were involved. The truth lies somewhere between myth and mundane. In either case, Helen left Sparta. Whether by choice, spell, or sailboat, it mattered little. The Greeks called it an abduction. Menelaus called it an insult. And the oath kicked in. The call to war across Greece. Kings were summoned. Ships were built. Speeches were made. Maps were consulted with puzzled brows. It had been years, almost decades, since many had last seen each other. But the oath was clear. This was not a swift mobilization. It took years to gather troops, supplies, and enthusiasm. The ancient world moved at the pace of oxen and oaths, not email. But eventually, an armada was launched, and all because of a golden apple. But here's the quiet question that lies underneath the armor and legend. Was Paris truly to blame? Or had the gods, through their own rivalries and boredom, simply found a pawn? So the war had been declared, or rather, agreed upon, muttered about in palace halls, and reluctantly set in motion. Now, you're not yet on the windswept plains outside Troy, where the famous heroes strike poses worthy of sculpture. You are instead in the quieter corners of Greece, among storage sheds, harbor towns, reluctant nobles, and carpenters hastily building ships that creak before they touch the sea. This is the part no epic poem lingers on, the long, dusty logistical tangle that is starting a war in the ancient world, assembling the league of the grumbling. The oath was clear. All who had courted Helen must now help recover her. But that was easier said than done. Some of those men had only half-heartedly tried to win Helen's hand. Others had forgotten they'd even sworn an oath, made long ago over watered wine and roasted lamb. One by one, the Greek kings and warlords were summoned. Agamemnon, the high king of Mycenae and brother to Menelaus, took it upon himself to rally them. It was a bit like herding goats, but with more egos and fewer shepherds. They came from Ithaca, Sparta, Pylos, Argos, Thessaly, and beyond. Each brought his own ships, his own men, and his own reasons for dragging his sandals into the war. Some came for honor. Others came because not coming would be worse. Odysseus and the art of avoidance. Take Odysseus of Ithaca, for instance. He was known for cleverness, not enthusiasm. At the time of the call to arms, he was peacefully married to Penelope and had recently welcomed a child, Telemachus. Not exactly ideal timing for a decade-long military campaign. To avoid the draft, Odysseus famously pretended to be mad. He yoked a donkey and an ox together and began plowing the fields with salt, muttering nonsense. It was a decent act, until Palamedes, the emissary sent to retrieve him, placed baby Telemachus in the path of the plow. Odysseus swerved, sanity revealed. And so Odysseus packed up his ships, kissed Penelope goodbye, and went to war with a heavy sigh. History doesn't always begin with fanfare. Sometimes it begins with a muttered complaint and a reluctant sailor. Achilles and the prophecy of fame. Meanwhile, across the Aegean, a different hero was being recruited. Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, a semi-divine warrior whose feet were allegedly soft, but whose spear was quite the opposite, had been hidden away. His mother, wishing to prevent his early death, disguised him as a girl and tucked him among the daughters of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros. There he remained until Odysseus, using the kind of casual cunning that would become his signature, visited the island disguised as a merchant. He laid out trinkets and weapons. When the girls gathered around the pretty things, Achilles revealed himself by going straight for the sword, recruited. Just like that, Achilles didn't go because he wanted to. He went because a prophecy told him he would be remembered forever if he fought and died young. Fame in those days often came at the cost of a quiet life. The wind that wouldn't blow now, the ships were built, the men were gathered, and the armor was polished, but nothing moved. At the port of Aulis, the Greek armada sat idle, for days, then weeks, then longer. The sea was still. No wind stirred the sails. And here we enter the strange and solemn story of Iphigeni. The seers consulted omens, always an exciting process involving bird guts, torchlight, and vague interpretations. The gods were angry, they said. Artemis, in particular, had been offended. Why? Because Agamemnon, ever the tactful king, had shot one of her sacred deer and boasted about it. This was not wise. The price of forgiveness, a sacrifice. And not just any sacrifice. The goddess demanded Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia. The sacrifice that shaped the war. It's a quiet moment in myth, often rushed through in poetry, but lingering painfully in memory. Agamemnon, faced with the choice between family and command, sent for Iphigenia under false pretenses. He told her mother, Clytemnestra, that the girl was to be married to Achilles. She arrived in her best clothes, escorted by her mother, smiling in confusion. Accounts vary on what happened next. Some say she was killed. Others say Artemis spared her at the last moment, replacing her with a deer. But the wind did begin to blow. The fleet set sail. No bard sings long about the waking, about the dry salt air at Aulis, about the soldiers cleaning the same shield over and over, hoping for movement. Yet it was in these in-between moments that choices were made, many of them irreversible. First, contact with Troy. You may imagine, perhaps, that the Greeks arrived at Troy with battle cries and immediate conflict. But that is not how long wars begin. The Greeks landed. They built camps. They sent envoys. They demanded Helen's return. The Trojans, led by King Priam, advised by the cautious Antenor, and emboldened by the youthful confidence of Paris, refused. Helen, they said, was not to be given back. Some sources say she remained silent during these negotiations. Others hint that she spoke in riddles or poetry, or not at all. Either way, the die was cast. The early skirmishes before the war settled into its long, weary rhythm. There were days of motion, of single combats and formal duels. Paris offered to fight Menelaus directly. It was a spectacle, filled with pomp and eventual confusion. Paris lost, was saved by Aphrodite, and vanished from the field. So much for resolution. And so the Greeks dug in. They built walls. They organized patrols. They rationed supplies. There were no fireworks, no dramatic turning points, just the slow onset of a siege that would last nearly a decade. Daily, life in a siege. Here's where history grows especially quiet. The Greek encampment became its own city of sorts. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly. Soldiers grew bored. Supplies had to be ferried from Greece. Disputes over rations were common. Men shared stories, most of which were probably exaggerated. Wounds were nursed, laundry was done, and lice were picked off armor straps. Even heroes need clean socks. The Trojans, inside their great walled city, experienced something similar. The markets continued. Children were born. Priests held ceremonies, hoping to ward off the wrath of gods. This wasn't an epic every day. Most days were slow, and yet each day edged the world closer to disaster. Hector and the calm before his storm among the Trojans. Hector emerged as the true defender of the city. Unlike Paris, who was more fond of archery and perfumed cloaks, Hector was a commander. He did not seek glory. He sought peace, stability, and the survival of his people. He knew the war was avoidable. He also knew it was no longer stoppable. You might picture him walking the city walls, greeting his wife Andromache, his infant son Astyanax in his arms. You might imagine him listening to the elders argue in council chambers, knowing full well that words would not turn the tide. It is in these quieter moments that tragedy ripens. The gods keep meddling, and then there were the gods. Each day of the siege was worsened by divine meddling. Hera and Athena sent winds of conflict. Aphrodite protected Paris like a mother shielding a child. Apollo stirred plagues when disrespected. Zeus claimed to stay neutral, but somehow his neutrality always seemed to lean toward drama. The war was not just fought on earth. It was played out on celestial fields of pride and politics. For the mortals caught in the middle, it meant unpredictable weather, sickness, and death from afar. 10 years begin to blur eventually. The war settled into what we might call stagnation. Raids were carried out. Towns near Troy were sacked. Alliances shifted. New heroes arrived. But inside the Greek camp, time wore down even the strongest. Achilles, once invincible and fiery, began to grow distant. Odysseus schemed in silence. Menelaus brooded. Agamemnon bossed. There is something uniquely exhausting about a war that has no obvious end. They had come for Helen. But as days turned into years, even that original mission blurred into something less noble and more habitual. And all the while, Helen remained in Troy draped in fine cloth, pacing the palace halls, speaking little. What did she think of the war raging outside her window? Did she remember her home in Sparta? Or had even Helen begun to forget what started it all? You return now to the windswept plains outside Troy, not at the war's height, but at its end. God, it has been 10 years since the ships arrived. 10 years of dust and waiting, of raids and rituals, of quiet deaths and godly whims. The siege had settled into a routine long before the final Sparta quarrel between two Greeks unleashed the chain of events that would end it. But before the walls of Troy could fall, the Greeks had to first collapse from within. Achilles in the dull burn of pride. War's rhythm was disrupted when Agamemnon, high king of Mycenae and lord of grievances, insulted Achilles. The cause? A captured woman named Briseis. Achilles' war prize was taken by Agamemnon after he was forced to return his own. A petty squabble over honor, women, and pride, playing out against the backdrop of a decade-long siege. Achilles, disgusted, withdrew from battle. He did not storm away. He simply stopped. He and his men, his Myrmidons, sat in their tents while others died. The war ground on without him, but not well. Greeks fell. Morale sagged. Hope, that fragile ember in war, began to fade. Patroclus, the quiet substitute, entered. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, his friend, or perhaps more, depending on the historian's leanings, grew weary of inaction. He saw the suffering, the bleeding, the silence of the Greek camp, and he acted. Donning Achilles' armor, Patroclus led the Myrmidons into battle. It worked briefly. The Trojans fell back, mistaking him for the son of Theus. But then Hector, prince of Troy, brother of Paris, defender of the city, struck him down. It was a noble, even necessary act. But it awakened the storm. Achilles returns, but not for glory. Achilles' grief was quiet and terrible. He did not weep publicly. He did not deliver a speech. He simply returned to the battlefield, burned with a vengeance too old to be youthful. He killed Hector in a duel. But more than that, he desecrated Hector's body, dragging it behind his chariot in the dust. This was no act of valor. It was grief, warped into fury. And yet, in the end, he relented. Hector's father Priam, the elderly king of Troy, came to the Greek camp under cover of night. He did not bring armies, only a plea to return his son's body for proper burial. Achilles, in a moment of quiet humanity, agreed. The war paused, just briefly, for a funeral, a reminder that even in endless conflict, some things still mattered. Paris and the arrow of opportunity. Achilles. Death came soon after, not on the battlefield in glorious combat, but from a distance, an arrow, guided by Apollo, shot by Paris. Some say it struck his heel. Others say it found his chest. Either way, it was death. Achilles fell not in defiance, but in surprise. Paris, the instigator, the apple-chooser, had finally done something decisive. And then, as quietly as he entered history, Paris too was gone. Shot during a minor skirmish, denied aid by a spurned lover, he faded from myth as his city crumbled around him. The wooden horse no one believed in the war had no clear end in sight, even with Troy weakened. Walls still stood. Defenders still fought. The Greeks had no new tricks until Odysseus remembered something critical. He was tired. Tired men think sideways. And so, the wooden horse. It was not majestic at first. It was a curious thing. Tall, yes, but hollow, and left as a gift. The Greeks pretended to retreat. Fires were doused. Ships were hidden just beyond the horizon. Inside the horse were men silent, cramped, and likely regretting every meal they had eaten that week. Trojans, rejoicing, brought the horse into the city. Some suspected a trap. Cassandra, cursed to never be believed, warned them. Others scoffed. That night, while the city slept, the Greeks crept out. The fall of Troy. Less fire, More footsteps. The fall of Troy was not a swift collapse. It was a series of quiet disasters. Doors unbarred, guards ambushed, torches lit too late. The city burned. Not all at once. Fires spread like whispers. People screamed, yes, but also hid, fled, or simply sat in stunned silence. It was not noble. It was not cinematic. It was chaotic, ugly, and slow. Priam died at the altar of Zeus. His grandson, Astyanax, was thrown from the walls. And Helen? She returned to Menelaus. Whether she was rescued or reclaimed is a matter of perspective. He raised his sword to kill her and then dropped it. She lived. That's all the myth tells us. She lived. The survivors. A long journey home. Most Greek heroes did not return home swiftly. Odysseus wandered for 10 years more. Agamemnon returned to find betrayal. Menelaus sailed a meandering path, visiting Egypt and Phoenicia, chasing winds that refused to cooperate. That the gods did not stop meddling. The war may have ended, but the consequences refused to. And in Troy, those who remained, those not taken or slain, rebuilt, renamed, and remembered. Cassandra and the curse of knowing spare. A final thought for Cassandra. She saw it all. The apple, the argument, the war, the fall, and no one listened. She was taken as a slave by Agamemnon, only to die when he returned home to his own unraveling kingdom. Hers is perhaps the most enduring image of the war. A woman cursed with foresight, silenced not by chains but by disbelief. History is filled with such figures. Those who knew, those who spoke, those who were ignored. And so it ends. Or begins again. As you drift away from the firelight of this long and tangled tale, you may find yourself wondering, was it ever really about the apple? Or was it about pride? About choices made quietly, not heroically? About how easily small acts an insult, a gift, a refusal spiral into decades of consequence? The war didn't begin with a battle. It began with a party and ended with a gift. But between those bookends were years of patience, loss, stubbornness, and silence. History, after all, is not just built on battles. It's built on boredom, on waiting, on people who didn't want to go to war, but went anyway. And maybe that's why we still tell the tale, even when we're trying to fall asleep. You return gently to the ancient city of Troy, not at its fiery end, but in its golden days. Before warships touched its shores, before armor glinted outside its walls, when the kingdom still hummed with daily routine, markets sang with the yell. Calls of vendors and the scent of myrrh lingered in palace halls. This is not a story about a battle. It is a story about how a single object, a small, shiny apple, began to unravel a kingdom piece by piece, not with an explosion, but with a sigh. The gift nobody wanted. The apple in question, as you may recall, was not grown. It was made. Cast from gleaming gold, inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." It had no roots, no orchard, no harvest. It was not meant to be eaten or admired. It was designed for one thing only, to provoke. When Eris, goddess of discord, tossed it onto the banquet table at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, it set in motion a series of events that would ripple quietly through Troy. But what happened to the apple after Paris gave it to Aphrodite? Few people asked. Because the apple didn't vanish. It remained a gleaming reminder of a choice made in the highlands of Ida. And eventually, it came to Troy. Paris returns to Troy. When Paris returned to Troy from Sparta, he did not come empty-handed. He brought gifts, spoils, silks, and Helen. But among the more overlooked items packed into the folds of his belongings was the golden apple, a trophy not of war, but of decision. Priam, king of Troy, received his son warmly. He had long feared Paris would bring ruin, as foretold by prophecy. But years had passed, and the boy had returned alive with a woman of surpassing beauty. No, less. Still, not all were pleased. Hecuba, Paris's mother, watched Helen with narrowed eyes. Hector, Paris's brother, voiced only polite restraint. And Antenor, the gray-bearded counselor of Troy, muttered something about oaths and war. No one said no God, not when the city rejoiced. Not when Helen smiled. And so Paris settled into the palace, and the apple, unnoticed, was placed on a pedestal in his quarters. The palace whispers at first, it was merely a curiosity. A bit of foreign glitz in a city already known for its wealth. Golden apple gleamed in the torchlight, and servants whispered about it in the halls. What's it for? They asked each other, who is the fairest? Did he steal it? No one knew. Paris told no one, not even Helen, and so rumors grew. Some said it was a gift from Apollo. Others thought it a wedding token. A few suspected it held divine power. None of these were entirely wrong. But none were entirely right either. The apple sat quietly while the city began, imperceptibly, to shift. Helen, far from home, adapted. She learned the layout of the palace quickly, its rhythms, the strange clink of Lycian armor. In the hallways, the way the palace roof tiles hummed after a hot wind blew from the sea. She made no dramatic speeches. She did not weep or curse her fate. She walked the gardens slowly, smiled at children, and learned the names of the Trojan nobility. The people of Troy, some fascinated. Others wary began to see her less as the spark of war, and more as a curious new fixture in their court dot. But behind closed doors, the women of the court were less forgiving. They knew what it meant to arrive as a foreign bride. They saw the golden apple in Paris's chamber and whispered bitterly, "To the fairest? How convenient!" The kingdom's quiet imbalance. What made Troy powerful was not its walls, nor its gold, nor its sea-facing towers. It was balance. Priam balanced his sons. Hector the warrior, Paris the diplomat, Deiphobus the tactician. He balanced the city's merchants and priests, soldiers and nobles. Every decision was made with care, but the arrival of Helen, and the object that followed her nudged that balance off center. Suddenly, Paris had influence he never earned. Merchants brought him exotic perfumes. Courtiers laughed at his jokes, louder than before. Priam, always fair, now deferred more often to his younger son. Whether out of pride or fatigue, no one knew. And Hector, the city's truest defender, felt the weight of leadership without the warmth of recognition. The apple didn't shout. It hummed. Hector's burden grows in the quiet early mornings. Hector trained with the city guard. He adjusted their patrol routes, inspected the supply stores, and met with envoys from neighboring cities. He did the work of defending Troy, not just from outsiders, but from the slow unraveling that ambition brings. Hector knew the Greeks would not forget the oath. He knew that Helen's presence was not a love story, but a liability. He knew that. The golden apple, so carelessly displayed, might as well have been a war banner. But he said nothing, because Hector always said little. He believed in discipline, in duty, in doing the work. Still, each time he walked past Paris's chamber, past the door cracked open to show laughter, perfume, and idle chatter, he felt the coming storm. And he braced for it quietly. Troy's council fractures within the stone halls of Troy's palace. The council began to splinter. Antenor, long the voice of caution, advised returning Helen. "Send her back," he said. "Offer gifts. Make peace while peace is possible." Paris disagreed. Helen came willingly, he argued. It would be dishonorable to send her back like stolen grain. Deiphobus said little. He had begun to build stores of weapons, speaking only in numbers. And Priam, dear Priam, listened to all, but decided on none. The apple stayed in its place. And the days passed. The envoys arrived eventually. The Greeks sent envoys. Menelaus came, gritted teeth behind calm words. Odysseus stood beside him, his eyes sweeping the court, noting everything. They did not threaten. They requested. Return, Helen. Avoid bloodshed. Paris refused. Not loudly, not cruelly, but with the sort of smiling, poetic defiance that makes compromise impossible. We are not thieves, he said. We are lovers. Helen said nothing, and the apple, glinting behind him, said everything. The storm loomed quietly even after the envoys departed. There was no immediate war. There were weeks, perhaps months of normalcy. The markets stayed open. Horses were trained. Weddings were held, but the rhythm was off. You could feel it, like an out-of-place note in a familiar song. Troy was still beautiful, but its beauty had been stretched, bent, and somewhere, deep in the palace, a servant polished the apple once a week, wondering why its shine felt less golden than before. The apple's true power. It's easy to think the golden apple caused the war, but that's not quite right. It didn't start the war. It weakened. Foundation that might have prevented one. It made men choose pride over peace. It gave Paris the illusion of rightness. It reminded Helen, every time she saw it, that she was no longer a woman but a prize. And it ensured that Troy, for all its strength, would one day be known more for its fall than for its rise. In the dim candlelight of Paris's chamber, the apple remained, silent, heavy, not a weapon, but something far more dangerous. A symbol, a question, a judgment passed by a mortal boy on immortal goddesses, and echoed, day by day, through every hallway. In Troy. And now, dear listener, consider this. If the apple had been hidden, discarded, forgotten, would Troy have stood? We return to Troy still standing, still brilliant, just before the sky truly begins to darken. The Greeks are coming. You won't hear it yet in the city streets. The murmurs of war are still quiet, like a storm far off at sea. But in the high towers and within the hush of closed-door meetings, the preparations have begun. The golden apple still rests where Paris placed it, gleaming faintly. It no longer draws attention, but its work is done. It has transformed from trinket to omen, something people avoid mentioning, even as they catch its gleam from the corner of their eye. The quiet before the ships in the months following the Greek envoy's departure, life in Troy trudged on. Children learned arithmetic under open colonnades. Scribes copied temple inventories. Nobles still hosted feasts, though fewer, and more carefully. It was the sort of normality that happens not because everything is right, but because no one dares to admit how wrong things have become. The merchants whispered it. First, they noticed fewer foreign traders arriving at the docks. Routes that had once bustled with Phoenician goods grew quieter. Egyptian linen shipments slowed. Crete, always talkative, offered only silence. The sea was too quiet. The harbors too still. Even the birds, it seemed, had flown elsewhere. Helen. And the mirror Helen spent her mornings in the eastern palace courtyard, where the sun rose over the sea. She walked alone often, trailed only by a servant or two. She never asked questions, never gave orders. The people of Troy had begun calling her Zine, the foreigner, not with hatred, just resignation. She had no family in the city, no circle of friends, no civic duties. She was present, but not involved. One afternoon, she passed a bronze mirror hanging on a column and paused, long enough that the servant girl with her, not daring to ask why, finally wandered away. Helen looked into the mirror for many minutes. She saw beauty, yes, but she also saw distance. She had become the reason for things, not their participant, not queen, not wife, not prisoner. Just Helen. And behind her, reflected faintly in the chamber beyond, The golden apple glinted once again. The diviners speak in hushed voices Troy's priesthood, those guardians of omens, readers of smoke and entrails grew. Restless they spoke less openly now. Their auguries, once delivered in the city square with rich ceremony, were now mumbled in the privacy of temples. Birds circled oddly. Sacrifices yielded bad signs. Two-headed lambs, malformed doves, entrails curled the wrong way. They warned Priam. Quietly, the gods stir. We are being tested. Priam listened. And he nodded. And then he sat longer in his audience chamber each day, receiving fewer visitors. There comes a time when even kings begin to defer to silence. Cassandra's curse echoes louder. Cassandra, daughter of Priam, spoke the truth. She always had, and she was always ignored. She told of ships forming on the horizon, of blood on the palace stones, of flames licking the skirts of Noblew, and but her curse was cruel. Apollo had given her the gift of prophecy, then ensured no one would ever believe her. So she stood in the halls, pale and wild-eyed, dismissed as mad. She pointed to the apple. That thing, she said, it will end us, as surely as if it were a blade. Paris laughed when he heard of it. It's just a token, he said, from a contest I won long ago. But he never touched it again. The walls are measured. Troy's walls were legendary. Built by gods Poseidon and Apollo. If the old tales are to be believed, they were high, thick, and lined with parapets. Engineers tested their strength with weights and cartloads. And yet quietly, the masons were summoned. Repairs were made. Reinforcements added. Dry moats cleared. Wells checked. Even Hector, always composed, personally oversaw the barrack stores. He drilled soldiers at dawn, not because he feared the Greeks, but because he feared not preparing. That's how history unfolds. After all, in the spaces between confidence and contingency, the women weave faster inside the women's quarters of Troy. The rhythms of daily life continued, but faster. The weavers worked longer. Cloaks for soldiers, tunics for children, ropes, slings, bandages. No one declared war yet, but the looms knew. Even Helen began stitching. Her hands were graceful but unsure. She never quite kept pace. She often paused, needle suspended mid-air, eyes fixed on some distant place no one else could see. She had once woven in Sparta. Then it was delicate things, floral patterns, festival gowns. Now she stitched hems onto bandages. Antenor's final plea. Antenor, counselor to Priam since the king's youth, made one last effort to reverse the tide. He called for a private council. A small room. No guards. Just voices. He brought his case not with fury, but fatigue. Send her back, he said. Send her back with dignity, with gifts, with regret, if need be. But send her. Hector said nothing. Priam looked away. Paris smiled. You speak of surrender, he said. I speak of survival, said Antenor. Helen was not present at this council. But later that evening, she walked past Antenor in the colonnade. She paused. He looked at her, and she gave the faintest bow of the head. Not of guilt, of understanding. The apple disappears then. One morning, the apple was gone. No one saw who took it. Paris denied, removing it. The servants said they hadn't touched it. Some believed it had been stolen. Others thought it had finally done its work and vanished. But Helen noticed. She went into the chamber as usual and paused before the pedestal. Her fingers reached out to touch what was no longer there. The next day, she stopped walking in the eastern courtyard. The ships are sighted. It was a clear day when they appeared. Like dots at first, just specks against the Aegean blue. Then sails hundreds rising, like a flock of white wings across the water. The Greeks had come. Menelaus. Agamemnon. Odysseus. Ajax. Achilles. The princes of Greece No trumpet was blown in Troy. No panic erupted. The people simply watched. Some shaded their eyes. Some brought children in from the streets. In the harbor, the last merchant ship quietly slipped away. The city holds its breath. That night, Troy held its breath. Every hearth seemed to burn lower. Every step echoed longer. No one knew what the morning would bring. The soldiers waited by the gates, armor polished, spears ready. The priests lit incense and prayed. Hector stood on the walls. Helen sat in her chamber, brushing her hair in silence. And somewhere in the city, no one knew exactly where, the golden apple glinted faintly beneath a piece of cloth, still present, still heavy. And so the question hung over Troy like smoke. Was this the punishment of gods, the result of one man's vanity, or the slow, inevitable unwinding of pride that had grown too comfortable? The ships had come, but the real undoing of Troy had begun long before the first sail caught wind. It had begun when a boy was told to judge immortals and chose beauty. You return to Troy in its final season. The ships have landed. Thousands of Greeks now surround the city, and the siege has begun not as a thunderous crash, but as a quiet wall, tightening inch by inch. Yet within Troy, the rhythms of life continue, even as they fray. This is not yet the end. It is the slow unspooling of the tapestry, the last fading weeks of a kingdom unraveling, one thread at a time. And though the apple is gone from sight, its influence hums through every corridor. Siege settles. The Greeks, as expected, did not storm the gates on arrival. Troy was too well defended, too well planned. So they camped. And waited, and raided. Small outposts outside the city were sacked. Fields were burned. Wells were poisoned. Supplies tightened. But the walls held. Inside Troy, the people adapted to siege life with the grim pragmatism of all besieged. Cities. Meals grew simpler. Salted fish, dried figs. Bread stretched with barley husks. Water was rationed. Tallow candles replaced fine oil lamps. The mood was not panic. It was patience. Worn, brittle patience. The women of Troy endure. It is here, behind the grand stories of war, that the quieter endurance of Troy unfold in the quarters of its women. Each day was a small battle. Against scarcity, fear, fatigue, the noble women took turns organizing supplies. Servants were given extra duties. Children were taught games that required no space or food. Helen worked too. She prepared herbs, sorted bundles of linen for the wounded. She moved through the palace without fanfare, silent and constant like the tide. Some resented her still. Others simply accepted her, like an inherited curse no one could return. No one mentioned the apple anymore, but its absence was like a missing tooth, always felt, even if never discussed. The city council splinters within the council chamber. Cracks deepened. Priam, now older and slower in speech, left more decisions to his sons. Deiphobus, ever the militarist, wanted to strike out, to lead a bold charge and scatter the Greeks. Hector refused. We defend, he said. We endure. Paris offered diplomacy. Let me speak to Menelaus again, he said. Perhaps we can negotiate peace. Antenor said nothing. He only stared out the window, watching smoke rise from nearby hills where Troy's outer farms once stood. No consensus. No plan, only more. Waiting. Cassandra's final prophecies. Cassandra continued to walk the halls, speaking truths no one would heed. They will not win by force, she said, but they will find a way inside. She warned of trickery, of fire in the heart of the city, of the gods abandoning their altars. At night, she sat on the palace steps, speaking to no one. The guards whispered she had begun dreaming of wooden animals. No one listened. They had never listened. Helen and Hector one quiet afternoon. Helen found Hector near the battlements, looking out over the Greek encampment. She did not speak. She simply stood beside him, watching. After a long pause, he said, "If you had not come here, would they still have come?" Helen was quiet a moment longer. Then she replied, "They were always looking for a reason." Hector nodded. He did. Not blame her. He never had Dot in another time, in another version of the world. They might have been family. But no, they were simply two tired souls watching inevitability creep closer. The death of Paris did not die in glorious battle. He was shot in a skirmish outside the walls by Philoctetes, wielding the bow of Heracles. He was brought back bleeding, cradled by his remaining brothers. He lingered in pain, whispering names only Aphrodite might understand. Before he died, he asked for Helen. She came and sat beside him. He reached for her hand. She took it. He did not speak of beauty or desire, only of a field and sheep and the wind on Mount Ida. Dot, and then he was gone. They buried him in the palace garden, beneath olive trees. The apple was never found. Some believed he had taken it with him. The horse, you know what came next. Odysseus, weary of siege and endless death, devised the final ruse. A great wooden horse, left as a gift. The Greeks feigned retreat, left the beach, earned a few tents for drama, and sailed just beyond. The line of sight, Dot inside the horse. Warriors, Trojans debated. Cassandra screamed. Antenor argued. Priam hesitated, but the people, eager for hope, for peace, for a return to normal life, dragged the horse inside Dot, and that night, while Troy slept, the gates opened from within. The fall of Troy was not a single moment. Dot. It was an hour of doors crashing, torches hissing, screams and commands lost in the smoke. Palaces burned, altars cracked, children hid in cupboards and under tables. Priam was killed at the altar of Zeus. Cassandra was dragged away by Greek hands, still shouting truths no one recorded. Dot and Helen? She stood on the balcony of the eastern wing, watching it burn. Menelaus found her there. He raised his sword. She looked at him, without pleading, without fear. Dot, and he lowered it. He took her hand, and they left. The apple's legacy in the ashes? No one found the apple, but its presence lingered. Dot. It had not summoned the war, but it had prepared the ground. That it had shifted the pride of gods into the hands of mortals. Dot, it had whispered to Paris, shimmered in the palace, sparked rumors and counsel. Chambers sat quietly in the background, while fate walked slowly toward the gates. Sometimes history changes not with fire, but with shine. Dot, with the smallest choices, who we flatter, what we desire, what we refuse to return. Troy fell because of many things, but among them, gleaming silently, was a small golden fruit with a petty inscription. And so we end with this. In your own world, in your own quiet days, where do the apples rest? What do we cherish that may one day unravel more than we know? What small, shiny things have we placed on pedestals? And what would we give to take them down? Again? Close your eyes and let the clamor of war recede. Let the ships fade. Let Troy vanish behind you like a dream you don't quite remember. We return not to the battlefield, nor to the moment Helen became a queen or a cause, but much earlier to the quiet corners of her life, before history noticed her. To Sparta, nestled in the folds of Laconia, where mornings began with dew on limestone and ended with the flicker of olive oil lamps. This is the story of Helen before she became Helen of Troy, when she was simply Helen of Sparta, a daughter of uncertain origin, raised behind stone walls with too many expectations and very little freedom. A birth that was already a story. The tale of Helen's birth is myth tangled in myth. Some said she was the daughter of Zeus and Leda, born from an egg after Zeus took the form of a swan. Others insisted she was fully mortal, daughter of Leda, and King Tyndareus of Sparta. No one quite agreed. But the stories persisted. Helen herself never spoke of them. She simply grew up with the understanding that she was different, not because of her beauty, not yet, but because of the strange reverence that surrounded her. Like incense that never faded. Childhood, among marble and rules, Helen's early years were shaped not by play, but by ritual. She was taught to walk with grace before she learned to run. She was taught to speak only when spoken to lower her eyes when praised, to smile just enough to appear kind, but never so much as to invite impropriety. In Sparta, the daughters of kings were raised with discipline, like future statues. Their lives were carved by custom. Helen woke before dawn, helped by handmaidens into woolen garments. She sat for hours at the loom, her hands nimble, her back straight. Meals were modest. Sweetness was rare. Conversation was formal. She knew the names of Sparta's rivers before she knew the names of her own cousins. And always, always she was watched. The mirror in the marble hall, it was in her 12th year that Helen first saw herself clearly. In the great hall of the palace stood a polished bronze mirror, taller than a man. It had been a gift from a merchant of Crete, and it caught the light in strange ways. One afternoon, left briefly alone, Helen approached it. She looked at her face not out of vanity, but out of curiosity. What did others see? A pale brow, a soft line of jaw, eyes that flickered between green and gray depending on the light, hair that refused to stay braided, no matter how tightly it was wound. She didn't feel beautiful. She felt observed, that it was the beginning of something she would never escape. Festival and the first public glance. When Helen was around 14, she was presented at the Carnea Festival, Sparta's celebration of Apollo, featuring races, music, and the ceremonial unveiling of noble daughters. It was the first time she had walked among the people without a veil. She wore white linen, tied with a red cord at the waist. Her hair had been brushed and braided for hours. As she passed through the Agra, people turned, not just men, everyone. Old women with olive-skin hands, foreign merchants, children who fell silent. She didn't meet their eyes. She didn't need to. The silence spoke loud enough. Tyndareus and the shadow of marriage. King Tyndareus, Helen's father or stepfather, depending on the tale, was a pragmatic man. He had ruled Sparta through drought, revolt, and the slow decay of its alliances. He loved Helen, but he also saw her as pivotal. She would not just marry. She would secure Sparta. By her 15th year, envoys began to arrive from Corinth, from Argos, from Thessaly, from Ithaca, princes, generals, and kings, each seeking a wife not just of noble blood, but of whispered divinity. A woman rumored to be the daughter of a god was a political treasure. Helen sat in the women's quarters. While these discussions were held, she stitched patterns into tunics while her future was bartered in the next room. And always, her name was spoken with careful awe, like a fragile vase, handed from one buyer to the next. The courting, the suitors came in waves. Some brought poetry. Others brought horses. One brought an elaborate crown said to be forged in the Cyclades. Helen remained polite, distant, observant. She did not dream of love. She did not hate the process. She simply endured it. Each man looked at her as if trying to decipher a riddle carved into marble. No one asked her what she wanted. No one thought to. The choice that wasn't hers. Eventually, Tyndareus made a decision. He would not offend the powerful houses of Greece by choosing rashly. Instead, at the advice of Odysseus Clever, even then, he required an oath. All suitors would swear to defend Helen's eventual husband, whoever he might be, against any who would seek to harm or reclaim her. With the oath made, Helen was given to Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon, lord of Mycenae. He was kind and strong and practical. They were married in spring. The ceremony was grand, but hollow to her ears. Sparta as a wife marriage changed little in Helen's daily life. She rose early. She managed servants. She walked the gardens with sandals that made no sound. Menelaus was respectful, but busy. He spoke often of treaties, harvest yields, and border patrols. Helen listened, and nodded, and sometimes in the quiet of the olive grove. Behind the palace, she whispered to herself, not words of love or sorrow, but simply her name, Helen, as if trying to hold on to it before it dissolved into wife, queen, property. The glimmer of restlessness it was during a rare diplomatic visit that Helen saw a foreign poet recite under moonlight. He told stories of islands beyond Crete, of swans that could speak, of apples made of gold. She watched, transfixed not by the man, but by the distance his stories offered. That night she dreamt of ships, not warships, just ships, moving across the sea like free thoughts. The arrival of Paris, and then Paris came, Prince of Troy, supposedly here on a diplomatic mission. Young, dressed too finely, smelling of cedar and oil, he smiled often. He praised the palace's architecture. He played the lyre surprisingly well, and he watched Helen the way most others did, but differently. He looked not as if she were divine, but as if she were real. Their conversations were polite, then thoughtful, then quiet. Menelaus, soon called away to Crete, left them in the same palace, and history began to creak toward motion. The apple never meant to reach her. Some say Paris showed her the apple. Some say Aphrodite whispered in Helen's ear. Some say she chose to go. Some say she was taken. But before any of that, before ships launched or oaths were called, Helen stood on the balcony in Sparta alone and watched the horizon. Not with longing, but with a kind of still curiosity. As if she were asking, what would happen if I disappeared? So we end section 1 with this thought. Before Helen was a legend, she was a girl in a palace. Before she was blamed for a war, she was the subject of 1,000 decisions made by others. And before she ever saw the walls of Troy, she had already begun to disappear quietly, day by day, into the roles written for her.